Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to this night's edition of WU Matters, WU Talks. My name is Sebastian Laudon. I'm a journalist and currently I work for the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit as their representative for Austria. I've been asked to chair this discussion, and I will do that with great pleasure, but also with deep respect, both towards the distinguished speakers, but also towards the incredibly important topic. I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight, which is not really necessary, but I will do it anyway. And first, I would like to ask you to welcome our host tonight, Edeltraud Hanappi-Egger. She is the boss of this breathtaking campus. She's a computer scientist and professor for computer science, and she became rector of this Vienna University for Economics and Business in 2015. She is also the vice president of Universities Austria. Our second speaker is a guest from abroad, Michael Ignatieff. He's president and rector of the Central European University, a private university that has come to fame in the last months especially. He's a former politician for the Liberal Party in Canada, his home country, and he's a widely renowned academic, a champion of human rights, a successful book author. His latest book is called The Ordinary Virtues, Moral Order in a Divided World. But foremost, he describes himself as a teacher. Please, a warm applause for Mrs. Hanappi-Egger and Professor Ignatieff. Right. Our topic tonight, as you all know, otherwise you wouldn't be here, is both relevant and somewhat urgent. But it's also kind of troubling that we should meet in the year 2017 to discuss this topic. Tonight is all about the role of universities as being key to an open society and to what extent they are being targeted by hostile politicians or political hostility. To start with, I would like to ask you, Professor Ignatieff, to sort of give us a short summary or a short update on where the situation of the Central European University and its issues with the Hungarian government is right now. It seems like there is sort of a chance that everything would turn out well. Is that correct?
Well, I hope so. And before I answer your question, this is what politicians do when they're playing for time. I just want to say I have a case of campus envy. It's so beautiful here. You're so lucky. We're proud of our campus in Budapest, and I hope you'll come and visit. But first of all, thank Edeltraud and Sebastian, particularly Edeltraud, for the invitation. CU, for those of you who don't know anything about it, is a graduate university. We do masters and PhDs in social sciences and humanities. We've been in Budapest for 26 years. We're a private university. There are about 1,800 students as opposed to 22,000 here, am I right? So we're smaller, but we like to think small is beautiful. I'm about to do something that will make Edeltraud unhappy, which is if you're undergraduates and you're thinking of doing a master's or PhD in Central Europe, remember us. I mean, first you have to go to Edeltraud's university, but as a second choice, okay, we're pretty good. Check us out. Anyway, all right. Now, to the question. We were faced with legislation in April of this year which put impossible new legislative burdens on us. They changed the rules in the middle of the game. We'd been there for 26 years. Suddenly, the government changed the rules. I won't go into what the changes were, but we felt this was an attack on our academic freedom, a politically motivated attack on a free institution. So we stood up. We attracted widespread support, including in Austria, and I thank all the Austrians for their support. I think the public pressure and public opposition then forced the government into negotiations. The negotiations were between the state of New York, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and his staff, and the government of Hungary in the summer. For about 8 weeks, the two sides negotiated. In early September, we thought we had an agreement that would allow us to stay in Budapest. And then last week, the government suddenly introduced an amendment to the law which said, let's give them another year. So instead of achieving security, stability based in the rule of law, we have another year of political uncertainty. I should say I don't think it threatens the existence of CEU. We're a privately funded university with a long tradition. We will survive, we will thrive. But we are being subjected to an extension of legal uncertainty, which is damaging for any institution. So the bottom line here, and I will then stop, believe me, I won't be as long next time. You students may know the difference between rule of law and rule by law. Rule of law is where you have a system of judicial review, independent judiciary, you can appeal against a government decision, the courts are independent. That's rule of law. Rule by law is where basically a government uses law in an arbitrary or discretionary manner. We want to stay in Hungary. We don't have a political quarrel with the Hungarian government. But if you want academic freedom, you have to have rule of law. And that's our problem. We're operating in an environment where we do not have the rule of law. We think we will, we are optimistic that we'll solve this problem, but that's where we are right now on October 25th, whatever this is, and I'll be more concise next time.
Just a quick follow-up. Is it fair to say that sort of the target here was not so much the university itself, but George Soros, who funds or mainly funds the university?
I can't speak about the government's intentions or what was driving it. I think there's no question that George Soros, who endowed the university, it's an incredible story. He creates a university to assist all the nations of Central and Eastern Europe in a democratic transition. He thinks, quite rightly, that this part of the world needs great new universities. I mean, Vienna has wonderful universities, but in Hungary, in Poland, in Czech Republic, in the Balkans, university freedom had been crushed under communism. So he thinks, let's start a new university. So it's a great idea. And he put a huge amount of money into this and has been at it since 1987. Many people will criticize Soros, but no one should doubt his devotion to academic freedom and to freedom itself, to the idea of an open society. I don't think there's any doubt that he is the chief target of this. And the reason I say that is not to be polemical, but if you look at what the Hungarian government's re-election campaign is, it consists almost exclusively of an attack on Mr. Soros for a variety of things that I will hesitate to characterize the government's campaign. It's not my job to do so, but I think there's no doubt that that's what's really going on. And in my view, this raises an issue about academic freedom that needs to be clearly understood. Academic freedom faces two ways. You have to be independent of government, right? But you also have to be independent of your sources of financial support. And it's very important that nobody thinks, for example, that I take orders from Mr. Soros. I respect him, I admire his ideals, but this university is not run by Mr. Soros. So we've been trying to convince the Hungarian government that this is an independent institution. So the battle for academic freedom has two sides. One, to defend ourselves against the Hungarian government, but also to assure the Hungarian public and anybody who listens that academic freedom depends on institutional independence. I'm not accountable to Mr. Soros, I'm accountable to a board of trustees. This may sound like detail, but let me tell you, it's the crucial basis of academic freedom for all institutions.
Mrs. Hanappi-Egger, so we heard CU is a very specific situation, privately funded and sort of targeted also for the person who funded it. WU is of course in a completely different situation, publicly funded, defined by law. How would you say such frame conditions reflect on the independence and freedom of a university?
So, good evening. Well, first of all, I have, because we are at the university, I have to add some of your introduction, because we are not so much in front with fake news. So I'm not a professor for computer science anymore. I have been.
You've been, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but at WU I have been a professor for gender and diversity in organizations. So just to make this clear.
I'm so sorry.
Well, concerning your question, I think, yeah, well, WU is, as you said, a public university, meaning that we are publicly funded. But at the same time, there is a kind of philosophy behind, namely that education, academic education, is a public good and should therefore be funded publicly. So the private idea by, asking for tuition fees would be more in the idea with education is an investment in your very own human capital, your increasing of your human capital. So public universities are, and WU is kind of existing because there exists a university law saying that we do exist. And we also have a specification of our duties and tasks and responsibilities, like saying we have to have, we are there because of creation of new knowledge, namely based on basic research. We are responsible for knowledge transfer to further develop society and to contribute to the societal welfare. Of course, it is expected us to educate young people and to contribute to the intellectual capital of a society, but also we are committed to specific values such as equal opportunity, gender equality, integrity, and these kind of things. So this means that the public university is funded by the taxpayers, but of course then we are also forced to legitimize our societal standing and to show that it makes sense that we exist as a public university. And of course this is an issue we could probably discuss in more detail a little bit later. But what me concerns is listening to Michael is that there is somehow a kind of a paradox concerning universities. So on one side we would say, or we would at least go for the idea that universities are the intellectual backbones of societies. But at the same time, this means that we have always to criticize the existing systems. So I would say universities are the pain in the ass of society. But at the same time, a society has to accept to be criticized all the time. And in particular, maybe the perspectives of majorities, right? So I think there is a kind of an ambivalent situation in criticizing your feeding hand. At the same time, you need a democratic level in a society, accepting that this is for the sake of the further development of this society. And I think this makes it so difficult. And then, of course, you would say, well, there are democratic elections, and you have to accept the results, and then we have new governments, and we will have a new university policy and regulations, and so on and so on. So I think this is a rather difficult situation, which might sometimes cause irritation, sometimes cause critique towards university and what they are doing and their self-understanding.
Mm-hmm. We heard about rule of law or rule by law, but there's also rule by budget.
No.
As a public, no, it's not a topic. As a publicly financed institution, isn't that the case, that you always have to sort of fight for the necessary fundings? And wouldn't you in some days, at some points, wouldn't you wish for Mr. Soros, who just, you know, hands you the money and keeps out of it?
Well, I think there would be an interesting model. Well, first of all, of course, we are always kind of complaining about the budget and the budget cuts we are facing, and we are not competing in terms of some budget. And I just was looking up, like University of Harvard, they have $37 billion endowment, and there are some other examples. I think this is very, very fancy for Austrian and publicly funded universities. Nevertheless, at least I would argue that we can fight for money for the budget. At least the parliament was deciding in July to increase the university budget in order to allow the universities for further development and progress. Nevertheless, of course, from a, let's say, strategic point of view, you would not like to depend on a very specific financial source. So you would like to have a portfolio. So therefore, of course, I would be very glad to meet Mr. Soros once to explain why probably the students should go for the master programs to WU, yes. Particularly those of CU, but of course this was just a joke. No, I think financially depending on specific sources is a topic and a big issue. But on the other side, as a public university in Austria, and we have been left to autonomy, which was a great development, a big step in the Austrian history of universities. This means, of course, that also the public funding is somehow granted. So we do have a long-term perspective, which, of course, I mean, it's not enough, but still the parliament would be in trouble somehow just to decide not to offer enough money anymore for their public universities.
You also have a very elaborate system of sponsorships with businesses. How much, can you just roughly tell me how much, what part of your budget comes through sponsors? Is it like close to 2% or 10 to 12%, okay,
which is nothing compared with Harvard and Yale. They have about 36% of their budget stemming
but it's still irrelevant
from the endowment, not from the donations or the funding.
But it's still a relevant part of your budget. And do you have sort of see the potential for conflicts when private companies sort of sponsor projects, sponsor university activities?
Well, it's a matter of, I would say, self-understanding of the university. So we never would allow any kind of donors to intervene with the academic freedom. So we would have, if we are talking about sponsorship relationships, we would have very specific contracts saying what do they pay, what do they get, and they normally would get a kind of a branding, not inside the lecturing rooms, by the way, but outside, and then they would, I don't know, use a lecturing room for a meeting or whatsoever. So this is very clearly specified. What is the deal about? We would not allow them to intervene with academic affairs. Nevertheless, for instance, if we have sponsored professorships, then of course we would go for because of the reason of transparency, to also name this, you know, that this is a professorship sponsored by, to show that there is a donation behind, and it might be at least the expectation to meet this future professor sometimes, to have a kind of an exchange program, but never, of course, and all our contracts would say that they are not allowed to intervene in academic affairs. This is very strongly a business of the university. And
that's also acknowledged by the industry, by the companies? Okay.
Definitely.
Michael, you've mentioned the wide public support that CEU has sort of received in the past months. What's your take on where does it come from? How I get the feeling there was some kind of surprise also within your institution. Can you sort of give us a personal take on that?
Well, it's not every day that a university will look out of its front window and see literally thousands of people walking by your window, in the street, chanting free universities in a free society. I mean, there were 70 to 80,000 people in the streets of Budapest in April. You have to be made of stone not to be touched by that. And so then the question is where that comes from. And I think we became a symbol for a whole society that's increasingly concerned about the control that government has over the courts, over the media, over even the private sector, a sense that we became a symbol of freedom for society as a whole, so that I don't want to overdo this, I'm not in politics, we're not challenging the regime, but there's no question that, people would come up to me and say, fight, stand up. And I think sometimes universities do have to stand up. We're uncomfortable with this because we are genuinely not, I'm not an NGO, I'm not a political party. Who the Hungarian government, who the Hungarian people choose for their leader is absolutely not my business. I am married to a Hungarian, and that's her business, but it's not mine. I think that we became a symbol of something much larger, which is a sense that right across Central and Eastern Europe, in Poland, a little less in the Czech Republic, although the recent elections may give some concern, but definitely in Hungary, there was a sense that what's really at stake here is democracy, the health of democracy. I can't do anything about that. All I can do is defend our institution, and so we defended it. And we defended it by securing external support, because in societies where you have essentially single-party rule, I mean, they won the election. I'm not saying this is a tyranny. I'm not saying it's, I'm just saying they won the election and they dominate the political spectrum. You haven't got internal leverage that works very effectively. So whether you want to or not, you have to go to Brussels. You have to go to Berlin. You have to go to Washington and get people to be aware of your problem. Does a university like to do that? No, actually, I don't want to do that. I'd like to go to nice, earnest discussions of obscure, historical topics, which is what universities do most of the time. But if you have to fight, folks, you have to fight. And I think that's a general message. Universities do not want to fight. They do not want to be drawn into the political arena. But if you are faced with an attack that threatens to shut you down, you really have to stand up. Try not to make, and then always try to find a solution. And we're still trying to find a solution. But as I say, the problem here is that to get a solution that is enduring and stable, you have to have institutions that look like the rule of law, and that's a concern. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying they're gone in Hungary. I'm saying they're very stressed, and we need to be aware of them. I think the other thing, if I could just widen out for another moment here, I don't want you to see you as uniquely in trouble and difficulty. I mean, just go to Turkey, It's much tougher for academic freedom in Turkey. It's much tougher for academic freedom in Russia. It's much tougher for academic freedom in China. These are countries which have huge populations of young people just as bright and smart as you, who are yearning to live and learn in free institutions. And in all of these places, it's being strangled. So this discussion we're having tonight, we really need to remember the global scale of the challenge, because I don't think we've put academic freedom into the center of the battle for democracy worldwide, but it emphatically is at the center. They come after the courts, they come after the media, and sooner or later, they come after the universities. And this is an issue. And we can't be complacent about it, and we also need to be very honest about our failings. I don't want to sit here as a rector and president and say universities are without fault. I don't want to say to young students that you live in a genuinely free environment. We need to always ask whether it's as free as we claim it is. That's a challenge for a rector and a president that we deal with every day, to make sure that it doesn't become a little liberal or progressive, kind of cocoon, that you really are exposed as students to ideas that challenge you, that are different, that turn you upside down and shake you until the coins fall out of your trousers, which is what my experience of being an undergraduate was. I constantly felt being shaken. I didn't know what I believed a lot of the time. That's what a university is for. And if we're too comforting, we're too cozy, and we only allow people of a certain ideological appearance into a university, we betray academic freedom. So there are two problems. There's the threat from without, which is, oppressive governments or stupid governments. And then there are the problems within. And we need to be very honest about the problems within.
What I found as an interesting effect of the CEU situation was sort of also with the March for Science in March. I think it was in March.
No, it's
no,
not
April.
March.
That's not why it's called March.
No.
Is sort of a wake-up call that maybe we in saturated democracies have taken the freedom of science, the freedom of universities too much for granted. Also in Austria, CEU situation has gained a lot of momentum and a lot of awareness. How do you reflect on that? Did you see it that way?
Well, yeah, actually it was not only CEU, it was not only Turkey, it was even Mr. Trump who was kind of, signaling a wake-up call and saying we cannot take the freedom of research and the freedom of university for granted. So we have to legitimize the role of universities and to also kind of present solutions to questions and not reacting with more complicated and more abstract answers. Nevertheless, of course, I think the basic idea and the basic troubles we face is that, and coming back to the role of media, sometimes we would be asked for a very simple answer to a rather complex question. This is not the academic way of reflecting on things. So the basic or the standard answer would be, it depends on, right? So you just say, well, it depends on the perspective you take, it depends on, the theoretical background you choose, and so on and so on. And this sometimes, I think, also leaves people alone and unsatisfied, saying, well, why are we funding those guys, and why are we putting so much money there, and we don't get the answers we need, right? So I think it's a question of legitimation, but at the same time, it's also a question of how much uncertainty is a society accepting? How much can people accept that there is not the only solution and the only truth? But we are, very familiar in debating to each other, reflecting on different approaches and so on and so on. And this, I think, is rather difficult. So now I think it was a good sign to stand up for the freedom of science and academic freedom, to stand up for solidarity against populism, against right-wing movements, fake news ideas and alternative data or whatever came up as a concept of questioning the integrity and validity of scientific research. Nevertheless, what I could see is that those developments still go on. So we were not successful in stopping these tendencies. So and also in Austria, not just to reflect on the other countries, also in Austria, I mean, we have the discussion on, I would call it renationalization, after having those ideas from academic point of view that research and academic exchange always has to be internationally, and it also has to be, you know, global and worldwide, and so on and so on. Now we are facing more and more governments questioning the internationality, like, you know, the medical school we had in Austria saying, oh, why are we funding students in the medical schools, non-Austrians, and then they will leave Austria and they will not work here, you know, and shouldn't we kind of, you know, re-nationalize doing research and university or academic programs? So I think there are some issues coming up on the table, and we have really to think over how to deal with it.
I have a question to both of you, and then I would like to open the discussion for the audience, so you can sort of prepare if you have questions or remarks strictly on this topic, please. The question to both of you is, what could and should the universities, academic institutions do to increase the legitimization in the broader public, not just in the academic peer group, but sort of in broader society? What have proven to be measurements to sort of increase this public standing?
Yeah. Boy, you don't ask easy questions, do you? I think we have to accept it, start from the, it's a cliche, I know, but it's true. With freedom comes responsibility. You can't exercise freedom in an academic environment unless you accept a deep responsibility of the society in which you're present. The responsibility can take all kinds of practical forms, you know, policy suggestions, policy analysis. If you want to do X, here's what social science or economics will tell you is the shortest and fastest and most effective use of public resources to get there. Universities do that all day long, and it's extremely useful. And in a kind of post-truth, post-fact world, it's more important than ever, actually. You want, if you don't like experts, try ignorance. I mean, we really need to say that just as clearly as we can, you know. Try ignorance, you know, see how you like that. It's not going to go so well. We need to be elite institutions, unashamedly defending high academic standards, academic excellence. We need to defend those standards against all comers, but we can't be elitist. We need to make sure and work extremely hard to make sure that, you know, young people none of whose family has ever gone to a university think, this could be me, I could get there. Mm-hmm. We have to open the doors, maintaining elite standards, but being resolutely anti-elitist in everything we do. Reach out, reach out, reach out. So those are some of the things we need to do. And we need to be unafraid. I think we are faced with the biggest crisis in intellectual authority in many centuries, partly because of the social media revolution. Everybody in this room, I don't have it, I put it away. Everybody in this room has the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria in your pockets, right? And this is, I think that's a fantastic development. I think it's pretty wonderful. But it does mean that the authority, the intellectual authority that used to be monopolized inside universities is now available in each one of your pockets. And a university's function is to help you understand the difference between knowledge, rumor, fact, opinion, fantasy, self-deception, right? There is a thing called knowledge. It's very hard to find. When I find it, I want to hold on to it. It's very hard to find. Universities are there to make sure that in a field of information that's coming at you on these phones every second, you begin to understand what is knowledge here, what might be true here, what might be false. It's more important than ever that we do that well, that we do it without ideology, that we do it unsparingly, give you a hard time, you know, I mean, shake you around. Because that's what creates free citizens. I mean, I say this a lot, and I'm talking particularly to the undergraduates in the audience. I am a very old man, and the one thing I have learned is that the hardest thing in life is to think for yourself. It's really hard, and it's actually harder and harder as I get older. So the challenge of a university education is to give you the tools to think for yourself, not to be bullied by fashion, not to be intimidated by opinion, not to think what you think simply because the person next to you says it in a very persuasive and loud way. But ask yourself, is this true? This is the core of what universities do. And we're not doing a terrific job about it. We peddle a lot of intellectual fashions. We peddle a lot of phony ideology. We peddle a lot of garbage sometimes. And we need to get, one of the reasons we're losing authority and prestige is that some of what we do just isn't good enough. And we aren't tough enough with ourselves and with our students. Because the social media revolution means that we're in a blizzard of information, a blizzard of falsehood, a blizzard of lies. And the things that universities uniquely do are actually more important than ever. And I think we're not being honest about the problems here. We're not being honest about what we need to. When I look at my own, the graduate programs in my own university, I think to myself, 80% of our master's students will not go on to do a PhD. They will end their education at the master's level. What the hell is a master's degree for in the 21st century? What is this thing for? What is it that you need to go out holding in your hand that is what are you a master or a mistress of exactly? Universities need to ask that question really hard, and we want to do that at sea. If they just leave us the hell alone, that's what I want to do with my time there. Because I feel a deep commitment to the students that we take. We take students from 120 countries. This is their one shot to find out what it is to think for yourself and know what is true and what is false. And if we miss that chance, they only have 2 years with us, they may never get that chance again. So it's a sense of the urgency of what we do, the importance of what we do, and being able to stand up to funders, private and public, and say, this is our job. This is what we do. We're the only outfit that really does this. And so we need your support. You want free citizens? We're the people who know how to create free citizens. Sorry to give you a big thing, but I get carried away on this subject.
It's a big thing, hard to disagree on. Would you agree?
Well, partially at least. Well, first of all, yeah, I guess the WU campus is one example how we kind of deal with our way of being open to public. So we decided very consciously not to build any walls and any fences around the campus, but to invite the public to come and to join and to use this space for meeting, for exchanging, for whatsoever. And even on weekends, you would see a lot of visitors coming in. Now, the library and learning centers, we figured out that we have about 1/3 users coming from an external institution. They're not WU students, not WU members, but they are students from other universities, from applied universities, and even kids from schools to come here and to use these resources. I think this is one big issue we have here, and we very consciously we're doing these kind of things, like creating also this public lecture series, WU Matters, WU Talks. So really consciously invite public people to join in and to use the infrastructure we have, which was definitely paid by taxpayers, not by business or industry or single donors. Now, what I could see in our international exchanges with other rectors and deans, of course, what we all agree on is that we were very bad in demonstrating our impact we have. It's not just being a university, and dealing with ourselves all the time and about our problems and our topics, but really to say, how are we contributing to the further development of society? And this is the whole topic of how can we show and identify and present the impact we have. And we do have impact not only by our researchers in terms of, they would hopefully advise policymakers, hopefully the policymakers would listen to faculty members, but we also have impacts by educating the future key players of society. Of course, they don't want to go all to do research and science, but they would have jobs and they would probably and hopefully be in leading positions in society. And our responsibility now is to educate those young people to become responsible leaders and that they are kind of committed also to academic way of thinking. So I think it's also not, it's an issue of quality of our educational program in terms of like HVU, in terms of what do they know about business economics, but at the same time relating it to societal contexts such as sustainability or responsibility. At the same time, I think the most important thing is, and this, I think there is still space for improvement, that we are hopefully are educating and promoting young people in terms of their mindset. How will they perceive the world and the environment if they leave this university? Which kind of mindset will they have? Will they be open-minded? Will they have the tools for critical analysis, for specifying and searching for solutions? Will they have a self-understanding of integrity and of kind of academic spirit we would like to deliver? And of course we have and I think this is a big challenge from a university's perspective, to put this into a kind of a curriculum. But it's not only a question of classes and courses, it's also a question of which kind of communication and exchange and experiences will those young people have in this time they spend at the university. And this is probably the big issue. And there we are kind of educating, promoting young people, being able to contribute to the increase of societal welfare.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions in the audience right now? Not yet, maybe later. Just wave your hand.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Oh yes, thank you for breaking the ice.
Hello, sorry, I'm socially awkward, so I'll try to word this. One of the comments that spoke out to me quite a bit was Professor Ignatieff's comment about universities not doing enough to get certain students to be able to access education. I come from a disadvantaged background, so somehow did my master's degree here after my bachelor's degree in Canada, where you're from. And so when I hear universities or people involved in academia discussing making university accessible to disadvantaged students, whether it's in a tuition-free environment or somewhere like Canada where there's high tuition fees, it seems a bit, it often to me seems to fall a bit flat, that it's hard to, it's, you know, even without tuition fees or even with a scholarship, there's multiple other barriers that keep students from being able to attend universities, and a university is only as open a reflection of society as, you know, its student body makes it. So I guess, maybe what are both universities doing behind the scenes, whether keeping in mind that there's differences for a publicly funded university and a private university, what are they doing to make them more accessible places to students, and what are they not doing that they need to change?
Thank you very much.
I think that the barriers to access are economic, so you want to make sure that we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our master's and PhD programs balance academic merit and then try and take any economic circumstances off the table. So we're proud of the fact that we provide generous master's and doctoral stipends. But that's only part of the story, it seems to me. The one thing I feel about university access, that there are a lot of cultural, psychological, social barriers of access to education that are just as important. There's just a lot of people in our society who think that's never going to be me. My dad didn't go, my mom didn't go, so I don't go, right? I mean, that's the much more difficult problem. And there universities can do something, and we need to do something, and that means sending our recruiters out to schools, to high schools. My university does not do that, but perhaps we should. You've got to get to a bright 17 or 18-year-old who thinks, I'm not going to university, and make the light suddenly go on. This could be me. Great universities do that. So that, it seems to me, is my direct answer. It's a matter of changing expectation, giving people a sense, this could be me. Why not me? I'm as smart as that stuff. And then making sure when they get to us that there are no economic barriers that hold an able student back. But we got to put the economic, the cultural, the social, the psychological all together if you're going to have a successful strategy on access.
At WU, we created a new program, what we call WU at School, because we figured out that due to our evaluation that we only have about 7% of socially weak background students, and we thought that's not really huge amount of students. And I totally agree with you. So what we tried is to sketch a multi-layer program, saying it's not just enough to offer the students tuition-free education. We even go a step further and we offer a scholarship for those brilliant young people coming and interested, who are interested in economics and business. And we granted about 15 scholarships last time, which is, I mean, it's not very much, but if you see the group of the young people and their stories and their CVs, that's really highly impressive. And these are really young people who are very much interested in, going on and using this window of opportunity for their personal life. Nevertheless, I think it's a multi-layer issue. So first of all, we identified those schools we are not recruiting from. And these are very, very often hotspot schools. So we send our ambassadors, young students, going there, telling the kids what does it mean to study at WU. We invite classes to the campus for campus days. We are contributing to the kids' university, even trying the very young one to get into contact with a university and what are they talking about within this huge campus here and building here. But if they are here, of course, they need some kind of mentorship. So we also created a mentoring program, even a senior mentoring program where our faculty members would contribute to help those people to come in and to gain those cultural knowledge necessary at the university, in particular if they are first academics and they don't have this social backup in the family. Now, at least what we could see now is that more and more people would use these chances they get, and they by themselves would become ambassadors for the idea, yeah, why not me, why not you? So for instance, we do have this volunteering program where we have buddies, and buddies would spend time with kids, and now we have one case where one of these young kids decided to study at WU and become a buddy himself and to mentor young kids. So it's a huge issue, but what we have to see and what we have to think is that social mobility is not a question of a university level. I mean, we still have an issue. We still are thinking over how to bridge the school and university fields. Nevertheless, the social selection and the social exclusion happens in the primary school and secondary school. And therefore, I deeply believe that we have to focus on the whole educational system and what is going on in the kindergarten, what is happening in the primary school, what is going on in the secondary school. But because in the end of this huge path and social exclusion, then there the universities are. As I said, I don't want to not to take up the responsibility we have, but we shouldn't ignore that social exclusion starts in a very early beginning in the whole story.
Another question. Ja, bitte.
I have a question for you, Professor. You talked about internal and outside risks to academic freedom. What is your opinion on this trend coming from US campuses on excluding or uninviting professors or guest speakers that have a very, let's say, dissenting opinion to the mainstream that is present at universities? Because there were some cases now at European universities as well. Richard Dawkins was uninvited, I think in the UK somewhere, or was it in the US, one in a Swiss university. What is your opinion on this kind of seeing universities as also intellectual safe space? Do you think that this is critical and adds to this divide that we see?
I think I was alluding when I said there's some threats to academic freedom without, and there's some threats within. And by threats within, I mean sometimes universities make a lousy use of their freedom. I mean, hey, we all make lousy use of our freedom. I've made some pretty terrible choices. Institutions are no different. We make difficult choices. I taught at the Kennedy School of Government for a decade, and I just saw this autumn they invited, then disinvited Chelsea Manning. They got themselves in a terrible tangle over that. As someone who loves that institution, I thought, oh my God, what, invite them, don't invite them, but don't disinvite someone, right? It's just a mistake, Universities have a tremendously important role as public spaces. I mean, Edeltraud has this, where, you put this public thing together that we're on tonight. This is open to the public, as I understand it. And universities around the world do that. We're the public square to an extraordinary degree. And how we invite and not invite defines what the public square is. And I think everybody, I said somewhat earlier, everybody's a little concerned about universities becoming a kind of preserve of a kind of safe, liberal, progressive orientation, and those are the people who get invited, and then people who really want to challenge that consensus don't. And I think that's built up enormous popular anger in the United States. I don't want to concede to populism. I want to stand up against it. But for God's sake, if you say you believe in academic freedom and then don't invite anybody who challenges anything that your tenured professors actually want to hear, you're actually betraying this freedom. Let me give you a specific example. Small liberal arts college in Vermont, which I know very well, Middlebury, invites a conservative speaker to speak. He is then denounced as a racist. He's denounced as as being all kinds of things, but mostly a racist. He gets up and gives a quite, he gives a proper talk. You may like it, you may not like it, but it's a proper university talk. He was shouted down in such a way that he couldn't be heard. And what's disturbing about that is that a lot of professors on that campus thought, that academic freedom means protecting your values and standing up against racism, sexism, homophobia, all the things that most people, and rightly feel, are anathema to a free society. But I just think academic freedom is a much chillier virtue than that. It means creating a public space in which you sometimes hear stuff you really don't want to hear. And the easy denunciations of something as racist, the easy denunciations of something as classist, the easy denunciations of things as homophobic actually doesn't encourage free debate. It just shuts it down. And so you then open up a public sphere in which nobody will speak what they actually feel about things. And the university becomes a kind of cocoon, isolated from the broad and controversial currents that are sweeping through societies. And I think that does academic freedom harm. I mean, of course there are limits. I'm not going to invite anybody onto a campus, nor should you invite somebody who incites people to hatred or violence. There's some very good public order reasons why you shouldn't do that. And so you don't do that. I'm not saying anything goes, but I think American campuses particularly, and some European campuses, have got themselves into a terrible twist about this. And it is a feature of our lives, it is certainly a feature of mine, that I spend most of my life with people who more or less agree with me. That's the condition of being a fortunate, middle-class, educated person. I don't spend my time with people saying, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Well, actually, it wouldn't do me any harm. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? And so if we care about freedom, you know, it's freedom for everybody, provided these are people who are not actively destructive and preaching a kind of hatred that leads to violence and active humiliation of people. And people are taking offense too easily, in my view, as well. That's another issue. We've all got such fragile identities and fragile egos, and that's not what universities are for. Universities are there to teach you to be resilient, to stand up for yourself, to, you know. I should finally conclude with a sentence as a president and rector. It's actually really difficult, this stuff. When you actually have to make the decisions, I'm not sure I will get them right. I want that to be clear. But when those challenges come, we need to face them and defend this public space, because it's a space for all citizens. It's not just a space for us.
Thank you. We had another question here.
I really liked how you linked freedom and responsibility as two parts of the same coin. I really liked it, and this is why I would like to ask you the question, what do you understand by responsible research? And how do you ensure that your organization's responsible and not irresponsible research is done? And how do you understand it? So how do you simply say, do whatever you like, this is academic freedom, but stick to your own ethical standards, and then you cross your fingers and you hope that everybody has good ethical standards?
Yes.
Or do you simply say, you go through our teaching program and we will inject responsibility, miracle happens, some take it, others
Yes.
not, and you just rely on your teaching programs? Did you establish any kind of governance procedures? So you had long checklists and a lot of audits and a lot of bureaucratic burden. Everybody then says responsibility is a pain in the ass. That also would not work.
No.
Or do you allow citizens to get involved into agenda setting of research and tell scientists, well, sorry, we are paying you indirectly 100 million euro a year. Could we have a slight impact on what you're doing as a research? We have a problem here, a societal problem. Could we please have an influence on the agenda? Or is then this citizen hostility? Because it reduces your freedom. How do you deal with that?
I'm very unhappy about that question because it smoked me out. I thought I was going to get away with that freedom, responsibility stuff and get myself safely to a glass of wine with Edeltraud and not have to deal with this thing. So yeah. I'm furious at you, actually. I'm sure Edeltraud is too, because it's such an embarrassing, it's such an embarrassing question. And I don't mean to make light of it. It's precisely because I take it so seriously. Universities do a lot of things that are not merely a pain in the ass, they're also a waste of time and a waste of money. And so, you know, one criteria of responsibility for a publicly funded institution, but also for, you know, we get a lot of public funding from the European Research Council. I want us to be responsible spenders of that money because it's public money. I also want responsible use of the private money that we get for research. But some of what we do is it goes up a blind alley. Some of it does not solve a pressing social problem. Some of it merely results in a professor getting more personal reputation for excellent, clever thinking, right? Is that responsible? I mean, the question of responsibility is really complicated here. The ethical stuff is easy in a way. We don't want to, you know, do experimentation that harms or humiliates individuals. We don't want to do harm, for example, to animals. We're not a natural science faculty. There are harms that I think any responsible institution has to avoid, and we have the checklists that you describe. But the real problem is that a lot of what we do is completely useless. I mean, it's just interesting, thought-provoking, you know. Sometimes it follows a fashion and we jump on some train of fashion. It's very difficult, and it's very difficult to focus universities' research in a responsible manner, partly because of this, the universities have to push back against democratic accountability. I mean, Edeltraud said something very important, which, you know, because I'm a kind of vestigial Protestant, it rang a big bell, is justification. I mean, she said we have to justify ourselves. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we need to justify ourselves particularly, not to politicians. The people I feel I need to justify myself to are the people who never had a shot at university education and for whom university is a place on Mars, because they're the taxpayers. And many of them will never benefit from the things that everybody in this room takes for granted. I feel a deep burden of wanting to justify and be responsible to those persons, by which I mean I want to do something, one piece of research every couple of years that actually makes a welfare system a little better, devises an economic policy that doesn't crush people, you know, provides the brain power for an invention that makes their lives more efficient or more enjoyable. But it's a very indirect chain of causation. I can't stand in front of that person and say, by God, we've made your life better right now, and here are the 5 ways we've done it. Everybody has to understand that. The process of justification is complex and difficult, and you do not want majorities, democratic majorities, telling universities what they should study and what they should research. The most difficult part of universities is, as I say, a lot of what we do is useless. I have a very, very fine medieval history department. There's a certain kind of populist Democrat who would say, what the hell do you have studied medieval history for? It's all 600 years ago. Well, they're some of the finest scholars we have. I have analytic philosophers who think about the meaning of words in absolutely baffling ways, but whose purpose is to get everybody to use words properly, with respect and attention. I think that's a responsible thing to do. But how do I explain that to some politician who's got a 4-year mandate and has to answer to that person who's never gone to university? These are the real core problems, and they're difficult, and we have to be unapologetic about them and say, look, a lot of what we do can't be justified in the standard ways that political logic defines. We should be as responsible as we can, but frankly, some of the stuff we're going to do is going to strike you as crazy, useless, and a waste of time. And damn it, that's why you need to support universities. That's not easy, but that's what I believe.
You want to add to that?
Well, at a public university, I think we have a kind of easy job, so to say, because we simply negotiate with the government the next 3 years, right? And they obviously would also impose some topics we would have to deal with it. For instance, of course, for university, we're very famous for doing the third and the second mission, research and education. We're only specified by doing basic research, which doesn't mean that it's always nonsense or not always not applicable or whatsoever. So I think there is a kind of a understanding that universities are doing basic research, and it might be that we do not see the results or the application for this knowledge in the next 2, 3, 4, 10 years. I think that's fine, as long as this is not the only thing we are doing. So from time to time, obviously, we have to communicate what we are doing and why this makes sense and why this makes a difference for the societal development. And this comes very much in by negotiating with the government the performance contract for the next 3 years, and we know already that social dimension will be an issue. We know already that the third mission came up a few years ago because they said it's not enough that the university is doing research and education. They also have to deal with the contribution concerning the regional development, but also doing knowledge transfer and all these kind of things. And now we have the third mission. And internationally speaking, we have to be really attractive for highly talented young people. And how could we do this? By showing that the university is dealing with interesting topics on one side. On the other side, we have now the big international movement going on that universities have to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know pretty well. So I think there are some things going on that on one side, of course, university have this very unique position saying, well, we also there just to be creative and innovative, and who cares when you will need those knowledge we are creating here. But at the same time, of course, there are some political changes in the world that universities now have to deal with in terms of contributing.
Thank you. We have another question in the back.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on the question about responsibility. What is our responsibility of us sitting here in this room towards the scholars who are now under risk or under detention in Turkey, in China, in Africa, the closure of St. Peter's University, as well as the pressures that have been put on CEU? What can we do?
Well, this allows me to say just how important international solidarity among academics is when you get in a jam. I mean, it allows me to say to Austrians and to Edeltraud and to all the universities who stood up for us, it makes a difference. There was a period when the Prime Minister of Hungary was getting 5 or 6 letters a day from universities around the world. And that impressed, I think, upon the Prime Minister that there were a lot of people concerned about this issue. Right at this minute, I don't know whether Edeltraud has this thing, I have a student, a CU, enrolled CU student who's under arrest in Turkey. So we do what we can. That is, we've sent, I've requested a chance to talk to the Turkish ambassador about this. We will send letters to the president of Turkey. This is an urgent matter. And I do think that letters matter. I do think that having international declarations of solidarity matter. Partly on the kind of Amnesty International model from the 60s, you got to shine a light. As long as somebody who is doing something feels the light of public visibility is on them, it has some influence on the behavior of regimes. I don't want to overstate this, but it has some. As long in St. Petersburg, there is international concern about the future of the European University of St. Petersburg, it becomes that much more difficult for the municipal and federal authorities in Russia to close it down. As soon as nobody seems to notice, it's gone. It's the spotlight that imposes limitations on what regimes can get away with. So if you're asked to sign letters in defense of arrested Chinese scholars or Turkish scholars or Russian scholars, you should sign them. Because the cliche is they make no difference. I'm here to tell you they do make a difference.
Any more questions from the audience? Great.
I would like to ask Mr. Ignatieff whether or not you think anti-Semitism played a role in the war against your university, and whether or not you think anti-Semitism is still common in Europe, especially looking back at the Austrian election, where representatives of different political parties used terminology that not only me reminded of Nazi terminology, like let's make Austria Silberstein free. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave the Austrian context because I really am a visitor here. But I would say one thing in general, just it's an observation. The anti-Semitism of the 1930s looked you in the eye and said, I just don't like Jews, and the faster we get rid of them, the better, or banish them, or whatever. It was very explicit. The anti-Semitism of the 21st century looks you in the eye and says, me, anti-Semitic? There must be some mistake. I'm not anti-Semitic at all. So that you have a kind of dog whistle anti-Semitism that denies that it is. And this is a really modern 21st century phenomenon that is frightening and dangerous. I won't comment on Austria because you've been through an electoral process. I don't know, frankly, that much about Austria. But I have seen this dog whistle anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that says, moi, anti-Semitic? You must be mistaken. Some of my best friends are Jews. Really? It's that bad. Some of the elements of what the campaign against George Soros flirt with this. I want to be careful here. I don't want to attribute intention or motive to anybody. All I know is what I see. And what I see is dog whistle anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism that says we're not anti-Semitic. But it plays with old tropes. The rootless cosmopolitan financier who doesn't care about ordinary people and uses speculation to wreck their lives. Where have you heard that before, right? That's what I mean. It's a trope. It's picked up from the 1930s, and then it's recycled in a form that denies what it is. And this is extremely dangerous. And it's not just in one country. You see it in a lot of places. And it needs to be called out for what it is. Because it leads straight to hell, and we know exactly where it leads. You know, there you go.
Thank you. We have another question there, but before I would like to ask Mrs. Hanappi-Egger, because the new or to-be government was mentioned, what would be your biggest topics on a wish list towards a new government in terms of educational policy?
Well, this is a long wish list. I don't know.
Okay, just give us the top 3, maybe.
Well, first of all, I would hope that the new government has at least a vision concerning the Austrian public universities. I never heard in the last years where should the public university go there, which kind of an international positioning should they achieve in a few years. So a vision would be nice in terms of a positive picture on what are the Austrian universities for and where should they go. And then the second step would be to have serious commitment in terms of really seeing the necessity of a framework we need in order to reach this international position and to be competitive internationally in terms of funding. And I already advised the government or the last government not to talk about costs but to talk about investment. This makes sometimes more sense in terms of reflecting what they are doing. So the vision, the commitment, and then of course the third thing would be responsibility. So where will the whole agenda of the universities be positioned within which kind of ministry? And of course I would heavily argue for an own ministry for research, science and innovation, where the universities should be belong to, because this would, in my opinion, express the importance and the relevance of universities as academic institutions.
You mentioned the competitiveness, international competitiveness. Isn't that also part of the problem with all the rankings, the rankings of universities and so forth, that there is too much attention drawn by this international competitiveness, that you try to reach certain points in certain rankings or whatever?
Oh, we are always very critical on ratings and rankings, because we know, of course, that they are weighting indicators which you always could question, right? For instance, we saw the Financial Times ranking that they would put weight on the indicator of the salary the graduates of the university would get, and the increase of the salary within 3 years after they completed their studies. And then they would also take into account the size of the companies they work in. So now, coming from an Austrian perspective, saying, okay, they would have a good salary. The increase would not be so much anymore as probably in other countries, compared to the Chinese, where they have huge entrance salaries, and then they have another big jump of about 100% in their salaries. So they are kind of coming in these international rankings and ratings, pushing out some of the European countries just by this kind of career model they have, right? So of course we are aware of the fact that ratings and rankings always are neglecting the cultural context universities or educational system would work and the framework they would have to act in. Nevertheless, we have some ideas of benchmark universities. We would say, well, we have a kind of a structural similarity, so we could try to compare those benchmark universities. And of course, they have a very different framework. It's not only about the budget, it's about the issue of the relation between the number of faculty members and the student, so the student-faculty ratio, which is not at all internationally competitive, what we have in Austria. Okay. So there are some issues, of course, we can do in order to be internationally visible, of course, to have an important role also in a national context, but nevertheless, so we wouldn't go for international rankings and ratings in a situation we face now, but we definitely all would have some benchmark universities we would like to see us being competitive.
I see, thank you. So there was a question there.
Similar to the question that you just asked, I was wondering, where do you see universities going in the next 20 and 30 years in regards to the changing job market and the automatization and, as you also said, social media and all that stuff. Like you mentioned that that universities are creating the future leaders of our society, but shouldn't like how big of a percentage of the society should be part of the academia and should have had a study?
That's an interesting question. Who would like to answer first?
I can only think about the future by by thinking about the past. Being an ancient person, I entered undergraduate in 1965. That's when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and your generation is the beneficiary of the globalization of higher education, which is, universities are among the most globalized institutions in the world. I mean, I've said once already, we have students from 120 countries in our university, and I'm sure you have a very wide diversity. That diversity is good in itself in the sense that everybody has to muck in and live with people who do not share common premises. One of the things I say about teaching is never assume there's a we in the room. The we in the room has to be created. You've got people from different cultures, different religions, different languages learning together. There's no we there. It has to be created in a common dialogue in which you try and forge something you share. When you ask me what the future of the university is, it looks like that. It is the one place that I think can become the genuine vision of the global village. That the global village was coined by Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian theorist who was teaching me when I was back in the dinosaur age in 1965. But it's the university as an institution that has come closest to achieving that cosmopolitan post-national ideal. And I think that's had an enormous effect on the world. It's created a problem, which is that universities are creating a kind of cosmopolitan post-national elite. You talked about training the leaders of tomorrow. We don't want to have universities that take people away from their national roots and cause them to lose their connection to their national roots. So a globalized university has to balance that. It has to teach people to live in a global world, but also not to forget where the hell they came from and what the hell they care about. As for your question of what everybody should have a university education, I don't think we've got a clear story about that either. I think there are lots of people who shouldn't go to university. I think we have, for reasons of social mobility and social promotion, created the ideal that the university is the royal road to social ascent and social mobility. And I think that's too narrow. My son, to give you a very personal example, was not a person who should go to university, and he didn't go to university. He's achieved what he's done by going in another path. I'm very impressed by societies that have many paths to the top, not just one. And we want more paths to the top. Someone who leaves school at 16 and learns a trade, this is a path to be respected. It's a path to be invested in. It's as important to invest in that path as it is to invest in the path that I live within, which is the university. And so the university in 50 years, I think, will be the global village, but it shouldn't be the only path to social ascent. And we shouldn't go out promising students, if you take a university degree, you've got a lunch ticket for the rest of your life. Because that's the other reality about the future. We have no honest idea what the hell you're going to need to know in 50 years. We have no honest idea. We tell you we do, but the reality is we don't have a clue.
Now
I was educated in a classical educational system at the University of Toronto between 1965 and 1969. I didn't learn a single thing that predicted the future at all. But what I did learn to do, often by reading Latin, Greek, medieval history, totally useless subjects, is I learned to turn this thing on.
I think we have an objection.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I would disagree now, just, you know, with a little bit provocative. If we are looking at the labor market in, let's say, the next 20, 30, 40 years, I would say, well, there will be a lot of jobs, a lot of tasks who will be done by robots. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure that educating, debating, and intellectual development will not be done by robots. So we will still have those kind of meeting, exchanging, debating, and so on and so on. So my answer would be yes, as many as possible should go to the university, because this will be an institution where we teach and learn how to deal with uncertainty, how to specify underspecified situation and problems, to have a kind of an idea which instruments could we apply to be an intellectual way of, you know, experimental space and creativity. So I think we probably would have those aspects. We would say, okay, about, you know, maybe we have some faculty members who would say, okay, we could substitute them by robots. Then let's do it, but not in 20 years, now, tomorrow. Yeah, exactly. So very quickly. But the other one, really taking care of the personal development, the development of mindset, the development of maturity, then we need those kind of people and those kind of faculty members. So probably the university of the future is partly a kind of online database where we can do a lot of things, but mainly a meeting point for intellectual exchange.
So a real life surrounding.
Exactly.
For
an experimental lab for real life situations.
Great. Unless there are, yes, there is another question.
Yeah, thank you very much. As a PhD student in political science at CEU, I thought I have to say something and just reiterate what Rector Ignatieff said. I really would encourage everybody here who considers doing a PhD or master to file an application in Budapest.
Can you please invite me to CEU to have this kind of marketing activity,
yes.
Right? Okay. Yes,
it's
please.
only fair. We'll get Edeltraud to make her pitch at CEU.
No, but in serious, thank you very much also for what you said regarding education should be elite but never be elitist, and I think that's a lesson we certainly have to, or a point we have to reiterate and remember ourselves every day. Particularly, I think, at least this was my experience in Budapest, we were living in some kind of CEU bubble. Just if I look at my Hungarian language skills, how they developed in the last years, yeah. It's somewhat embarrassing. So, but
not as embarrassing as mine, let me tell you.
So, but my question would be concerning the scholar as an activist, the scholar as a politician, an NGO person, and so far we spoke basically partly that the political sphere comes into the university, but at the same time people with knowledge should go also into the society and try to leave a mark there. I would be grateful if you could briefly deliberate a bit about the potential danger and the gap, the tension between being a scholar pursuing the quest for knowledge and an activist pursuing a quest for pursuing a certain normative order. And while there are certainly a lot of benefits, if highly educated people with good skills go into the public sphere, there's also the danger, I think, of blurring the boundaries, which are very, very important to be separated. I could well imagine that parts of the motivation of the Hungarian government against the EU is that it's considered to be an activist institution which has a certain normative orientation, although I can clearly state in the training we get there is no normative orientation. I mean, we are sensitized to certain, but there's never a predefined outcome. So my question would be if you could deliberate about the tension, the scholar as an activist, the positive sides and the negative sides, particularly you also have been in politics.
I try to be more concise than I've been so far. I think scholars and researchers have an enormous public role. I think simply because they know stuff. They've thought about stuff. In the division of labor, they've taken that function. And the temptation is to move beyond what you know. Your authority depends on what you know, on your mastery of a discipline or your mastery of a problem, your understanding, your deep understanding of a particular issue, whether it's a welfare problem in a society, a problem about how to manage energy systems or climate change, or an analysis, a historical analysis of where Austria is at a particular moment. The fatal danger is to be tempted, particularly in the public arena, to start talking about stuff you actually don't know the hell a damn thing about. And we all face it, and I have been there, and I have strayed way beyond what I know. I've done a bit of that tonight. But yet, so intellectual life is a discipline. We talked about responsibility. You've got to be responsible to yourself and not talk a lot of damn nonsense about stuff you don't know. And I think academics sometimes do a fantastic job advocating on a particular issue upon which they have solid knowledge. You just see them on television or hear them on the radio or you hear them giving testimony in a parliament. You think, this person really knows her stuff. She just knows it. You got to listen to her because she knows it. And then there's another kind of thing you get from a lot of academics in which it kind of wanders around. And some of this has to do with, I think, the fatal word intellectual. We inherit a tradition of the omnicompetent man of letters, the omnicompetent intellectual, the public intellectual. Let me tell you, I've been there. It's one trap after another. You got to stick to what you know and refuse the temptation to go beyond that. And when you have that, the authority of real knowledge, you can leverage that into very useful and responsible public action. But it's full of temptations which you need to avoid.
Well, this would, yeah, I agree with you. But to be honest, I think that the expectation of the public sometimes is different from this. So when I'm contacted by media representatives, they always would expect my faculty members to be available within, I don't know, 2 hours, and to comment on whatever a minister said 1 hour ago. And it's very difficult to explain that this is not the task of faculty members to comment on whatever political announcement, but to advocate and to contribute to contribute to the informed debate. This is the role of faculty members, but not to show up as commenting single politicians' announcements. But this is really difficult even to explain to media representatives.
Okay, all right. I think we'll have to come to an end. I was told that precisely at 7:30 people start to leave from this event. It is now 7:42, so you can take it as a compliment for you two that you were sort of exciting enough to stay. I want to thank you, rectors, for the very interesting conversation. I want to thank you, the audience, for your lively contributions. Since we are very liberal on advertising here, I want to point out that there is a newspaper put out at the back. Feel free to take one. It's Die Zeit. It's the Austrian issue of Die Zeit. I was everything but an expert on educational policy before tonight. I don't qualify as one now, but how do you say, I'm still confused, but on a higher level. So thank you very much for this educational contribution for myself. Thank you, and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you.